Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. You know what? I see exactly that, but it's the ingratitude. And it's not right or wrong. It's just that those detectives have a lot of things in their head and they're used to moving along and it's a culturally accepted. And I can say this because I was, a near plank holder at the South Florida, the Broward Forensic Association, the FDIAI, and I can see the personalities and you just get used to them package that up, give me the bottom line. I'm going to move over to 10 witnesses that are waiting. And if I don't, they'll be scattered to the winds. So there's no disparity I'm throwing on detectives or anything else. But to your point, exactly right. If you could get, so what ends up happening, it comes across as brusque or irreverent and the technicians become upset or they're just trying to process this or they're not approved for overtime. And then there's angst on their side. And I hear this from them, and I was very close to it. My mom, like I said, was a non-sworn for years, and those are phenomenons. And you speak to it very adroitly when you say, sworn, because I was the entire time, and I worked both sides of it, and I found that to be very rewarding. But there's drawbacks because the more I'm spending on that scene, the less I'm talking to that person who's now talking to their sister, and that erodes that witness statements that's there. So how do we mitigate that? It's a blessing to have those folks, the CSI folks out here. And I said, it's not easy. And it's not something you got to come over here and to get upset about. Like, I can't do my job. You have to just tell them, if you involve me a little bit earlier, and the good leaders will. And that's where I think we can just really take something that's detrimental right now with the police work and turn that. You have to go through these trials to get to that next level over here. And that's what we're going through right now. So we can really supercharge up the forensics, get that to become near real time. And if we had a checklist to involve that, you could probably process that out pretty quickly. Like I said before, I don't know of a detective. I honestly, anybody who's in investigative role who could pass that IAI course. It's just the IAI certification. It's very in depth. You're having to do the math on trajectory. They can do this and they can provide you something. And if we can harness that, well, now everybody's contributing to the cause and they're not acting like the cleanup crew. And these come from hearing kind of those sort of comment over the years from different people, just right disparaging comments like that, like just get it to me, I need to know it. And it's a team effort, man. It's a race to see who's going to be to the finish line last and give the most to the equation. And now we're moving that ball. We're making points each time.
Yeah, and I will say this, and this, Tom. People solve murders, teams solve murders, not individuals. I want to just jump to what you were saying here because this is in the book, and I want to highlight it because it's so important.
Oh, very cool.
Right? We a lot of times the investigators, and I've been guilty of this many times over the years, of trying to make their theory fit the crime. Right? And you'll see that in American law enforcement, the culture kind of has us doing suspect based investigations, right? Chasing suspects. What we should be doing, and I put a lot of emphasis on this in the book, is we should be doing evidence based investigations, right? What is the evidence telling us, right?
Yeah,
like if I go to a crime scene and I see that blood spatter, and let's say that the girl is, it's blunt force trauma and all the injuries are to the left side of her face, right? And then you see maybe there's a stab wound even on the left side of her shoulder. Is our offender right-handed, right? I mean, if it's a frontal attack, I mean, just simple stuff, right? And again, that's where I think the crime scene techs and the forensic experts are a critical piece to the overall teamwork because they set and look at it from that viewpoint, right? What is the evidence telling me happened here? Not what is some witness telling me who the best potential suspect is. And again, I picked this up. I spent some time in the Netherlands back in 2000 with several of their deaf investigators, mostly out of Utrecht, the city of Utrecht, which is, I think, about an hour and a half from Amsterdam. But they 100%, they ignore suspects. They just look at the evidence. What's the evidence telling me? Where are they at? What's the blood spatter tell me? Is there signs of a struggle? Is it forced entry? Is it, can we determine any remorse in the scene? Can we determine control in the scene? Can we determine anger in the crimes? these kind of things, to where instead of chasing a suspect or a name, or, and we gotta have to remember, and I highlight this in the book, there's only three things that solve murders, right? Physical evidence, witnesses, and confessions. I mean, if you get down, it's really that simple. And the evidence is the best gold standard, whether that's DNA or a fingerprint. I mean, those are the two greatest gold standards, followed by other evidentiary items, of course. But, witnesses, you can't always depend on witnesses. They change their story. Their credibility gets impeached. They don't show up for trial, and so that's why a lot of cases come down. You got to get a confession if you don't have that physical evidence. But what prosecutors want is all three, right? The silver platter. They want a confession, they want physical evidence, they want witnesses. And what I see happening too with a lot of cold cases is there are a lot of risk averse prosecutors, right? When you bring a cold case to them, because in a lot of cold cases, they actually want twice as much evidence. And they'll be like, hey, this thing's old. I gotta overcome these obstacles. Can you get me some more? Can you find some more witnesses? But, a lot of people don't realize, and Jared, I probably said this on the first show, and I'll say this, and then I'll go back to you or Tom, but how hard it is to solve a cold case. If you think about the numbers, there's estimates that anyway, we could have up to 325,000 cold cases now. If you look at the numbers of solved cases, only about 1 in 5 cases do we have a clearly distinguishable suspect. 1 of 20 will the prosecutor charge. Only about 1 in 100 will you actually have a successful prosecution. That's crazy. Now, you'll see those numbers are a little better with IGG, right? As IGG has popped up, but then we also have to remember how little cases have been, or how few cases have been cleared with IGG. And that's even with Othram storming onto the scene and some of these other groups, we still, that's still in the low numbers of solves when you think about it. So, to your point, I think we need to figure out how can we get this evidence examined, evaluated, analyzed much faster. And I think that's what you were kind of saying. Did I hear you correctly there?
Yeah. And I'll say the other side of the equation, because a lot of the exonerations of the folks are looking through things through a different lens. And I got to do a little bit of film work, and I would hear about the bias. Example is Chris Tapp. I mean, you got to admit he's a great suspect because of his colleague who was with him, who was charged on the sexual battery. Okay. So I said, okay, let's not take a political stance on this, folks, but let's look at this. You have, say 10 hours a day, 600 magic minutes. And what do you want to devote those to of those minutes? Case in point, Black Dahlia. I got a chance to pick at that a little bit. They found a note, if I remember correctly, saying Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short, was married. So they figured out who the servicemen or former servicemen. They went on a train across country to go interview him, because this is the best suspect out here. Man, that's probably like a 2-day trip to go all the way over to Pennsylvania, if I recall, to go on to, get permission to interview this guy. He goes, look, it was a joke, man. We were trying to make a friend of his jealous. He goes, I'm not married to her at all or anything else. And so you're talking about, okay, return trip, 4 days are burned up there. That's gone. That is colder than, Shakespeare's grave at that point. But you have to devote resources, and you got to decide where to go. So, kind of offsetting that point is like, well, you can't just go, well, let the evidence sit back. I love it because, Jared, you know what I'm talking about when I say this. Let's try to disprove this theory. Try and knock it out of the water why the machine doesn't work. And let's go about it that way rather than run off that way. But, you have to make a choice eventually. Like I heard that said, well, isn't it true the captain said, who do you like for this? Well, that's just a colloquialism. Like, who do you like for it? Well, I like this guy. He's got a history of it and everything else. But I mean, what are you going to do? Like, not use your brain on that? And so maybe to offset a bit and to explain to people, nobody is trying to set anyone up on this over here. It's just that those detectives live with that scene of that person being opened up like a gutted deer. And this is why so many of them crawl into a bottle, and so many of them end their life earlier, because this is what they live with, and they're trying to give solutions. This is what they join for. They didn't join to make money. They joined to make a difference over here. So these are really the true victims on this stuff. So we have to mitigate that, offset that, explain, the personalities and the use of words and everything else. So I just do explain that as that's the phenomenon out here. Nobody's taking a shortcut. And if you come after those guys, they're going to work even slower now and more methodically and plot along. So it's just kind of an unfortunate time. But if we can rest those things, explain that, then people kind of go, oh, I never knew, I never understood. By the way, I'll say this: Black Dahlia, 47 minutes, where they took the fingerprints and they used a crude fax machine that the news service would do, sent them all the way over to Quantico, and in 47 minutes they had two cards for Elizabeth Short.
Yeah.
She had worked in a camp and everything else. So there's, they had her identified post-mortem from the autopsy in 1947. So there's an example of, it's got to be that synergistic, sort of maybe like cooking a meal for Thanksgiving. You're bringing everything at once
Sure.
in there, and you got to pay attention to all those things. But it's not easy, and it's not easy. Each one of these things is different. So I say that because, but to finish up my diatribe here, yeah, you absolutely have to blind yourself to that and not let that theory go along with it. Because, man, you've devoted so much time, your reputation's on the line, and you're going, I really think this is the guy. And you get to the end of it, and you're like, oh, it's not even him. And they go, what happened, Tom? And I'm like, I thought it was up to, and then, here, and here. But, but you got to try to disprove that. You got to knock that one out. But I like the the Netherlands mindset of looking at that things critically, because that will force you to blind yourself to it, to come up with that.
Hey, with that in mind,
Good
Joe,
stuff.
boy, this is awesome. I've just been kicking back, listening to you guys. It's been fantastic. So, Joe, I got a question for you. So in light of, especially like what you said about the Netherlands, when they're basically, they ignore the suspects and they just mostly focus on the evidence. In light of that, why do you think more detectives don't involve and make almost like a partnership with their CSI groups more often? It's like, to me, I see as I go around the country and I'm working with people, it's like, especially the non-sworn that we talked about earlier, there's a lot of detectives that just don't look at their CSIs. If they're civilians, they just don't look at them as equals and as professionals, and they don't utilize them to the extent that they should. And I think a lot of cases suffer because of that. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do, Jared. And I think what we're talking about at the very basic level is organizational culture. And through whether it's police departments or it's federal law enforcement agencies, state police agent, what you're going to find is folks that have the responsibility of just being right, the evidence collectors, because that's what a lot of detectives will view them as, right? Hey, they're going out and they're collecting the evidence. And I think it comes down that a lot of detectives, it's a status thing too in many departments, that a lot of folks are striving to become a detective, and there's just not a lot of, in the culture or the organizational culture of law enforcement. For me, where I see it in the southern states is they're non-sworn personnel. Hey, you're not even a sworn detective. What do you know? Okay, so you went to this school and you have this advanced degree in forensics. What does that matter? How's that going to help me solve my case? Whereas if they would just collaborate more, they would realize, and that's what we try to preach at our Cold Case Coalition,
Awesome.
Somebody is going to look at that scene, and that's why we have 3 or 4 crime scene techs that are part of our unit, because they have a whole different view of it. It's just like we have crime analysts that are part of our Cold Case Coalition, and they're looking at things from an analytical view, right? And you have to put all those components together to make a team. But I think it's just the culture of the organizations that, it's like anything. Let me show you a difference. We do some advanced training in the state, and most of this is homicide training or rape investigation, robbery. And so typically what happens is we'll have a room full of detectives and there'll be 4 or 5 patrol officers there. And I always ask them, hey, introduce yourselves. And we go around the room and they say, well, I'm just in patrol. I'm just a patrol officer. Well, and then what if you're a patrol officer in Durham, North Carolina, where we're responding to 60 or 70 homicides a year, right? You have gained a whole lot of valuable experience from, you're not just patrol, right? And I try to reinforce that. Same thing when crime scene techs come, right? Or our forensic folks is, they say, well, I just work CSI. I'm just on the crime. So, I mean, it's almost like the culture, right? I don't mean to beat this to death, but it's the culture is causing a lot of this. And it's hard for folks to come in and change that culture because, a lot of you got to remember what law enforcement is attracting is a lot of type A personalities, right? It's a lot of folks that, have strong opinions of things. They're type A and they don't want this person who's maybe, not as aggressive, that has these so-called soft skills, right? Of impeding on what they need done. Tom said it best. Hey, just give it to me now. Give me what you got, and I got to go interview these 8 other witnesses. So I'll take into consideration what you gave me. But I don't know. I probably didn't answer your question, but that's just from my optic what I see.
No, it's
And
perfect.
Same sort of phenomenon, Jared. Yeah, not to hijack it, but we did something I didn't like in the FBI. We would cut leads out to people. So you're working some kind of homicide or something, and I'm sending a lead out to someplace. I'm like, no, I need to be on an airplane and interview this person.
Yes.
I hated it with a passion because those little things. Let me think if I can articulate this well.
Well, part
Adam
of it
Walsh,
is you lose the passion of it. You lose the intensity of it, really, because it's not really your case. If you just got, somebody just calls you up and say, hey, go interview this person, you don't have, that's just human nature there. You lose some of that connectivity with the actual case. You're just like, well, I'm just going to go out and talk to this person. I not to run into the fiction part of it, but if you ever see Jason Bourne movies, that one scene where they send that 4-year Department of whatever State Department guy to go interview Jason Bourne, and he's just kind of nonchalantly walking into the room, and he's like, so who are you, Jason Bourne? You're going to talk to us whether you like it or not. And next thing you know, he's unconscious, laying on the floor, and has no idea what's going on. And that's, to me, it's kind of the same type of a scenario, that if you're going to lose that much connectivity, then it's worth it to send the original detective out there who's actually really involved with the case and trying to solve it.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.